My name is Karen Wright-Marsh. If you're just joining us, this is more of the morning around Know Better, Deepening Connections Through Stories. And I have the privilege of introducing Ann Snyder to you this morning, and she will be moderating our panel, which is going to be such a wonderful conversation called Cultivating Curiosity, the Power of Storytelling to Mediate Messy Conversations. Ann is the editor-in-chief of Comment Magazine, one of our sponsors this weekend. She is the founder of Breaking Ground, which is a growing institutional irrigation system seeking to leaven our common life with a Christian humanist lens. Ann is the host of the Whole Person Revolution podcast, the co-editor of a wonderful volume called Breaking Ground, Charting Our Course in a Pandemic Year, and she's the author of The Fabric of Character, a wise giver's guide to renewing our social and moral landscape. And I have to say that Ann brought with her friends Kathy and David and our beloved Alfred Woodard. Thank you for being with us this morning. So a whole community has gathered to hear this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you, Karen. I feel it's such an honor to be in this space. I've heard about this space for many years, and it's kind of amazing to be under that light. And Nicholas, I don't know if you're still here, Nicholas and Matt, but thank you so much for that conversation. It was just really beautiful, uniquely so, and just both of your freedom and authenticity in representing your work. And Abdullah, what you just did, I feel all of you all, it's like you wove a little hammock for us to sort of really talk to one another here. So as just said, my name is Ann. I get to edit this hopefully beautiful little magazine called Comment. And in many ways, the subject of this panel, which has been titled Cultivating Curiosity, the Power of Storytelling to Mediate Messy Conversations, has become somewhat surprisingly for me one of the most delicious success metrics of a magazine well produced. And we don't always hit it out of the park, but when we do, it's just very gratifying. I'm really here as a student of each of all four of you here, the work each of you do and how you do it. And as someone for whom the feedback of sentences like, I read this and felt so deeply seen, or I read this and it has transformed the fraught conversational zone that I have been experiencing with my daughter. Or I read this and somehow no longer do I feel paralyzed by polarized constituencies on my board and in my staff, but rather equipped with a third way that's complete with beauty, human dignity, and a more invitational posture towards faith-seeking understanding. Those kinds of testimonies and sentences that we get from time to time in the work I get to do are just some of the most hope-giving words an editor can hear, perhaps especially in this moment. I'm just going to say a few things that I don't think are news to any of you, but I'm going to say them anyways. We live in suspicious, shortcut-seducing, culturally segregated, and narratively combative times. We live in a country of 333 million people, and each one of these 333 million people contains multitudes. We have our individual memories and the ways in which we understand and tell the story of our lives. And then we also have a collective memory as a society to forge a public memory, one where there often seems to be, these days, so much more heat than light. This cauldron of all that, of course, is bubbling, not in a vacuum, but as part of a larger world enduring its own juncture of unusually acute tumult, with all the complexities, high stakes, ancient myths, and people sustaining origin stories that such tumult requires and also magnifies. Today in this conversation, I want to take a page from David's lecture last night and try to better understand from the unique lives and storytelling labors of each of the four people here, how it is that we, given the deep and varied stories we all carry within us, inside us but also beyond us, how it is that in that very layered narrative ferment of human being, we might nonetheless still approach our fellow stumbling creatures with a face of openness and a humble gaze. The most mature, life-giving, room-transforming people I know, and I'm actually including a few people in the front row here for being that for me, interact with others out of a belief in a story that says every single human being is precious and worthy of the conditions for safety and love. Theirs is a story that inspires joyful other-centeredness. It's a story that enables healing and a new flowering in our common life. The genius, of course, and where it gets more interesting, lies in understanding the precise conditions and detail of those, understanding the precise shape and detail of those conditions, the art of creating those conditions, an art that I hope today's conversation helps make a little bit more clear. I'm just going to give just some very brief introductions. They could each take a novel because of the lives they've led, but I'll just try to summarize very briefly. Greg Khalil here is the co-founder and president of Telos, which equips American leaders and their communities to better engage seemingly intractable conflict. Much of Telos's work has centered on the role of faith leaders and culture shapers in America's relationship to Israel, Palestine, and the broader Middle East. And more recently, they have ventured into facilitating immersive pilgrimages throughout the deep American South. Prior to founding Telos, Greg was a legal and communications advisor to Palestinian leaders on peace negotiations with Israel. He's also a founding member of Narrative 4, which is a global nonprofit that seeks to use story and media to cultivate empathy across divides. Gail Jessup White here, to my right, is the Public Relations and Community Engagement Officer at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which owns and operates Monticello, not too far from here. She is the author of the book Reclamation, Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, and a Descendant's Search for Her Family's Lasting Legacy. A former award-winning television reporter and anchor, Gail started her career at the New York Times. She has written and spoken extensively about her work at Monticello, the legacies of slavery, and her family's contributions to American history, which I hope we'll hear a little bit more about today. Jocelyn Diaz is a producer and television and film executive who has worked, I think, among other places at Disney, HBO, and ABC Television, and her portfolio is really broad. She's worked on original scripted dramas and comedy programming, documentaries and docuseries, comedy, sports, and concert specials. You'll find among her credits shows like House of the Dragon, Lost, Ugly Betty, Boardwalk Empire, Big Love, Into the Woods, Alexander and the Terrible. It's making me feel very pop culturally out of it. I need to get on this horrible, no good, very bad day. Berlin Station and Get Shorty. Thank you for being here. And Ian Solomon here is Dean of the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy right here at UVA, where he leads a multidisciplinary faculty of scholars and practitioners who are committed to creating new knowledge, developing ethical and effective leaders, and no small feat, advancing solutions to humanity's greatest policy challenges. He was trained as a lawyer and served for 4 years in the U.S. Senate for then Senator Barack Obama, before becoming, under President Obama, the U.S. Executive Director to the World Bank. He's been a McKinsey consultant, an associate dean and visiting lecturer at Yale Law School, and a vice president and lecturer in law at the University of Chicago. Before joining the Batten School as dean, he led his own international consulting practice focused on conflict and collaboration. So thank all of you for being here. I feel shaking in my boots. So I want to begin with a question that is actually a little bit more personal, partly to introduce you to the audience more fully in your integrated selves, but partly because I somewhat surprised myself years ago by saying yes to a role that involved being somewhat public about faith, and in my case, my own faith, and I just was never anticipating that. I thought I would enter a secular realm. And there are dangers in that over time where I call them like spiritual dangers a little bit when you get in sort of the professional religious world. And similarly, I think anytime we become pros at something like storytelling or conflict mediation, you become an expert at it, but you do it always for others. And you kind of get in the silo of the world, and there can be sort of a unconscious, not hubris that develops exactly, but in a weird way, you're so in it that in a funny way, it's also distant. And in this context of wanting to talk about the power of story to change and form and transform, and I think most beautifully, ideally, wake us up, I was wondering if you could just reflect on the last time you can remember that you were truly awakened by a story, one that kind of grabbed you out of just the temptations we feel towards numbness, complacency, that kind of yanked you out of maybe your pre-existing knowledge and opinions, and gave birth to a new life-giving sort of level of curiosity. I'll give you a second. They haven't heard these questions, so.
I'm totally prepared for something else.
I'm having a strong reaction to this moment, and it's awkward to do this publicly, but this is a panel about messy conversations, so I'm going to go there because the story that just comes to my mind and heart, which I haven't told, is something I'm experiencing right now. My phone is buzzing right now. You didn't mention I'm also a professor at Columbia University. Mm-hmm. I'm also Palestinian. And before I go into the story, which I haven't really thought of how to speak about, I just have to share a couple lines from Hafiz, the 14th century poet, because I think in fraught conversations, so much of what makes them fraught is this deep sense of anxiety and insecurity, that we think the other doesn't fully see us. And so we can't listen because we are not certain of our own position. So I just want to share these lines because this will show you where I'm coming from, and I think where I would guess many of the panelists whom I don't know are coming from too. But he wrote, "The small man builds cages for everyone he knows, while the sage, who has to duck her head when the moon hangs low, keeps dropping keys all night long for all the beautiful, rowdy prisoners." It's this idea of story being both cage and key. Story can destroy, and story can liberate us too. And we're in a moment right now where stories are cages. We're using this to divide each other, to actually build physical cages around entire people groups. And so why I needed to share that, because I want you to know my labor on this world is about dropping keys. That's how, at least I aspire to be. That's what I want to do in this world and leverage my power. But that's not the life that I've been born into. So a couple months ago, I was walking to a faculty event at Columbia with my co-professor, Ari Goldman. We teach a class called Covering Religion. He was the New York Times religion reporter for a couple decades, how journalists can write empathically about religion, which is often caricatured. And there was a huge protest on the outside, and there were bunches of Palestinian flags, bunches of Israeli flags. And so I'm an adjunct, which, if any of you know, like an adjunct means like I go to class a couple hours a week, one semester, one day. I'm not part of university life. I have a full life elsewhere, and I'm kind of like ignoring what's happening on because it's not my community. And so I see this, and there are these dueling Israeli-Palestinian protests. We go have our talk. I go home, and then later that night, I learn that a number of students were sprayed and has to go to the hospital with a chemical weapon on campus. As many as 16 students. Administration didn't say anything for more than 24 hours. And they were sprayed by two other students with skunk spray, allegedly, which is a banned chemical weapon. And so I'm like, wait, what is happening right here? It happened, and then you read the reports, and the reports were of pro-Palestinian students who had broken the rules to have this demonstration. No reports about the pro-Israeli students. And so all of this has blown up to what you're seeing in the media right now. And so President Biden last night rightly condemns anti-Semitism. This is a scourge that is growing like wildfire right now. This is something that we have to name and we have to confront. And yet, at the same time, I'm sitting here, I talk to these students on the lawn who are living out their values. They're risking their reputations. They're not out there speaking anti-Semitism. Many of the students who were attacked with this chemical weapon are Jewish. And I'm in this moment of, what do I do right now? I'm not associated with this community but I am. I'm an assistant adjunct professor at Columbia University. I'm Palestinian. There's students who are actually living out their values right now, who are saying that, like, the world is saying there's an active genocide right now, and I don't want my university to be complicit. Whatever you think about them, free speech has to matter. And so what's my role to live into this? And my phone is buzzing right now because this is being taken by people who want to cage us for these political purposes. There's provocateurs coming onto campus trying to cast this group as anti-Semitic and wanting to kill Jewish people, which is horrible, and anti-Semitism exists, or this group as wanting to simply annihilate all Palestinians. And yet, in this moment, there is a reality in which the stories and voices of people like mine are actively being ignored. And so how do you speak into this moment? So I'm feeling an awakening, not a curiosity, but I'm feeling something stirring inside me, which is saying, wait a second, I have to own my voice in ways that I don't yet know how, and I have to go on this journey. I know it's going to be costly, but I think the cost is greater in this moment for those of us who see that the world feels like it's falling apart, but it doesn't need to if those of us who really care about fundamental human rights for all Palestinians, for all Israelis, for all Jews, for everyone, everywhere, are willing to stand up and speak out. So that's where I'm at this moment.
Thank you, Greg. I can jump in now. Greg, I just want to say I was really appalled by what happened at your university last week with 100 students arrested by the NYPD. And we don't have to talk about that now, but yes, I support free speech, even when it's painful. We have to engage and we have to involve ourselves in a democratic system and in civic conversation. And that's part of what we do at Monticello. We're not just about history. We're just not about people like me reclaiming that history. We're about engaging in conversation. So to answer your question, Ann, I was stirred by a story that I heard on a podcast. Yes, I listen to podcasts, especially history. And this one was about World War I. This is something that happened more than 100 years ago. Of course, Germany was our enemy then. And this happened in Oklahoma, shortly after the Americans got in the war. And this young man who had come to America from Germany when he was 17 years old was working in a trade, and he had said something that offended his community. So he was dragged from his home, 30 years old. He was whipped, stripped and whipped. There was an attempt to tar and feather him. They didn't have any tar or feathers, so they were unsuccessful in that. The mayor stepped in. He was taken to a jail. The crowd of about 300 people was really rowdy, really upset, and the mayor said, he's been taken away. He's not in the jail. So you may go look in the jail. Well, of course, the man was still there. They dragged him from the jail, took him to the river, got a rope, and they hanged him on a tree. Before they hanged him, they said, do you have any last words? He prayed in German, and they allowed him to write a letter to his parents in Germany. I was touched by that story because it was so human. It also reminded me that my people are not the only ones who've suffered. Many of us have suffered. There have been many injustices imposed by humans on other humans. And that resonated with me. I have a 30-year-old son. I can't imagine something like that happening to him. But yes, I can. Yes, I can. He's a young black man, tall, broad-shouldered. So yes, I can. But my people are not the only ones. In this country, we still have so much work to do. We're living in conflicting times. It's not the first time ever. I invite you to engage in civic conversation. I'm not going to talk much because I'm much more interested in what other people have to say. But I invite you to listen to other people, as David, your husband, said yesterday. To let go of yourselves, which is hard to do. To seek freedom in your speech. To give yourself grace and to give others grace. When you look at someone else, think of that poor young man and his family and what they must have gone through. So that's the story that moved me. Thank you.
And go ahead, Jocelyn. Go ahead. I had a ladies first principle. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I would love to hear it.
Yeah, no, this is quite a panel to be on. Thank you. I've known Greg for 25 years, and there are no humans I hold in higher regard and have more respect for as a peacemaker doing really hard, important work. Of course, he reminded me yesterday of we were in law school together. We both acted. Neither of us is necessarily talented as thespians. But we both acted in A Few Good Men.
Were you in A Few Good Men, really?
Yes,
He
you
was
were.
the judge.
Wow, I was too.
And there's a scene, if you've seen the movie with Jack Nicholson, or he's being, interrogated by the prosecutor and saying, tell us the truth, tell us the truth. And he says, the truth? You want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
That was good. That was good. That was good.
This panel is about that question. Can we handle the truth when it's messy? When it indicts some of us, all of us, in some way? When it's on our campuses, or we see people suffering, and we realize that we all share stories of pain and suffering. A story that came to me recently was I live in Pavilion 10 on the lawn here at UVN. It's the one with the green shutters down on the left side if you're walking from the rotunda. And one of the longest residents there was John Minor. He basically was the law school. He was hired here at UVA in 1845. I think there was only one law professor at the time, and it was him. They didn't believe in presidents or deans. I don't know how they ever got anything done without deans. But he was the law school, and he used to teach here in the Rotunda and also in Pavilion 10. And this I just learned. So he would actually write out all the notes on a blackboard of his long 90-minute lectures, and they'd be on blackboards here in the Rotunda for the usually 15 to 20 law students that made up UVA Law School. And then his students would scramble to copy down all the notes that were on these boards as he would go and do the lectures. And he was here 1845 to 1895, the whole time living in Pavilion 10. In fact, at one point, he decided he didn't have enough room in the pavilion, so he cut down the wall and took over 2 student rooms as well, in the long rooms. I'd like to restore that part of history personally. But, and although he himself had said some things against slavery, he actually was quite a defender of the institution of slavery and thought that the South couldn't exist without it. And thought it would be premature to get rid of slavery. And I have on an exhibit in the basement of Pavilion 10 his tax records from 1863 that name the 21 individuals that he owned while serving here. He also was on the delegation that went out to greet the Union troops as they were coming to say, please don't burn down the University of Virginia. And even after the Civil War was over, he continued to teach about slave laws for a number of years and stayed on until 1895. And I learned recently that before he actually took the position here, he actually used to tutor the sons of John Davis, who also lived in Pavilion 10, whose murder by students when he went to break up a fight led to the creation of the honor system here. And I say all this just to every brick, even though this was rebuilt after the fire in 1895, but every brick and column of this institution is filled with stories. Can we handle the truth? That's our challenge.
So I would just like to say, as I was listening to all three of you speak, so impacted by what each of you had to share, and then was thinking about the nursery rhyme, one of these things is not like the other, which is a bit how I feel right now, because what my world has been is the creation of film and television, mostly scripted. Alfred, thank you for being here. Mostly scripted, meaning that it's mostly fictional. So I have worked in documentaries, which I love. I loved your documentary, Nicholas. I can't wait to see the next one. But so much has been about what are the stories that we see, that we consume on the television and streaming services and movies, and I've been lucky to be a part of telling those stories for a really long time. But what I will say that maybe has some connection with what you all just beautifully shared is someone asked me yesterday, who's a theologian here in the area, do you think that the media that we see right now in film and television is directing us, like directing society, or is it a reflection? Like, which is first, sort of chicken or the egg? And I will say, having been in Hollywood for a long time and inside those rooms and those sort of idea generation and then seeing it come to fruition, all of the creators behind them are humans and citizens and fathers and daughters and struggling like we all are. So as the times change and shift, you start to see, like if things feel maybe a bit darker in what you're consuming right now or what you're seeing right now, it's because those people who are creating those stories and directors and actors and writers are feeling and experiencing all of the same things that we all are and trying to figure out their part in it. And for my place in the world right now, more and more thinking about how can I take the tiller and shift that tool and shift that boat as influence in the way that I think that would be hopeful with what we do. So I feel like there's so many instances. I thought of so many stories because I work in stories when you ask that question, but I wanted to shift my answer a little bit because of what you all shared to say, I think that wherever we each find ourselves, and mine is squarely in storytelling, it can be a real impact and influence if you have power and privilege to use your voice to say, I think that it can be more egg than chicken, depending on which you think came first.
Thank you. You just provided a great segue to the very not rhetorical question that I feel somewhat urgent about these days, broadly and certainly in my own little work, which is a few of you have mentioned that stories are being actively used, the tool of narrative. I mean, we all kind of know narrative is more powerful than arguments for the most part these days. For better, for worse, we can debate, why that is, but there's something in the human brain, remembering specificity, grounding, roots, emotion, it all is this alchemy. And we all know, certainly in our politics, but I think in a lot of aspects of our life and the various spheres in which we live and work and study, big narratives are sweeping through that are often kind of singular in their focus, a narrative of power, a narrative of who the enemy is, who the scapegoat should be, et cetera, that are often certainly flattening complexity and one could say is sometimes manipulating like sort of the fullness of truth of history, and we have competing truths all jostling for turf. What characterizes a story, either in form or some other set of ingredients that can pierce through that kind of reductive way it seems like we could blame our media, whatever, that seems like we're all living in these like large narratives that explains our sense of felt chaos and sort of threat out there. What have you seen that can pierce through? Is it, what defines the kind of stories that cause one to pause for a second and question the sort of larger narrative that's constantly being sort of, often fear-drenched, that's being kind of stuffed down our throats?
I can start with this one because at Monticello, we specialize in storytelling. And the question I prepared for was this. What conversation did you find to be challenging? And because I work at a museum that used to be a plantation, and because we have guests coming from across the country and around the world, you can imagine I work at a breeding ground for controversial conversations. So I have found, with all due respect to our guides, and I should say with all respect to our guides, that the best way to break through, and our guides are brilliant at this, to break through with conversations that are challenging, is to humanize the people, in our case, who were enslaved, or to humanize the people who are our enemy. That's such a huge challenge. And when that happens, I've seen it. I've seen it when our guides speak to people. I've seen it when I speak to people. You can watch the change. You can watch the metamorphosis. You can watch the understanding. I didn't know that. I didn't think of that person as being like myself. I didn't think of, let's say, an enslaved person. Let's use James Hubbard, who escaped from Monticello a couple of times, who happens to have been one of my ancestors. Very tough guy. Didn't think of this person, of this being, as human. But when we tell these stories about why he wanted to escape, about how he planned his escape, about what happened to him when he was captured, and he was, then a light bulb seems to go off in people's heads. And they think, oh, yeah, this guy had longings just as I do. He longed for freedom. He longed for his family. And that breaks through. And I think when we're having conversations with people who don't agree with us politically, when we listen and when we see them as humans, they're like us. They have the same needs that we have. And this is hard for me, trust me. This is hard for me to do. But I've had conversations with people who clearly don't have the same political convictions I have. But I look at them and I think, you have a family, you're hungry, you want to go to a nice restaurant, you like nice shoes. You're just like me. Let me listen to you. That, to me, makes a difference. And then we can have some breakthroughs, but it's very, very, very challenging work.
I have a lot of thoughts here, but just to go on, the humanizing piece is key. And so the second question from, okay, humanizing is the answer. Well, how do you do that, and what does that mean? I think one overlooked aspect of empathy is we tend to be other-focused, and ultimately empathy is not just about seeing the humanity of the other, it's also about seeing the complexity within. None of us are totally sort of cogent beings. Our beliefs conflict, and so it's not just that, oh, wow, Ian, you are just, oh, you're a human being just like me. It's like, oh, wow, as Solzhenitsyn said, the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, and we're all heroes in our own story. Our people are the ones who did everything right and did everything correct, and we're the messiahs to the world. right? That's often sort of like our theological and story departure point. So I think it's important to just name sort of the complexity around empathy up front. But then the operationalization of like effective humanization is different. I think one tool that we found at Telos that's been transformative for me, and which helps keep my ego in check, is experience. It's that actual interchange with other human beings, because when you are in space, when you are in place, when you're having that face-to-face conversation, and when it's set up well, and ethically, so people can bring their full selves to the table, that's a real point where you can see not just the humanity of the other, but your connection to the other. That there is no I and thou, there is we, at a very embodied sense. And this is not just in the moment, it's multi-generational. I think there are a couple skills that I might highlight just very quickly for this, because I think art can do this well too. You don't need to go on some immersive experience. You can read a great book. This is how you can encounter people. You can binge on a great series. But I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that sort of cage-key dichotomy that I raised, because so much political storytelling is about power. And how do you get power? It's those people over there. They're the evil ones. They're the, so it's important for us to cultivate, in music, there are people with perfect pitch or relative pitch, but an ear, I would say, for the kind of cage storytelling. Like, what's the purpose behind the story? What is the storyteller trying us to do? Are they trying to incite anger against an entire group of people? Are they trying to shut a whole perspective and set of perspectives out? What's going on here? So I think it's important to understand what I would say, that when we do storytelling, the ultimate purpose, the telos, the idea of mutual flourishing, that like, how can I deny my neighbor what I would want for myself? Like, what is freedom if my neighbor has to be caged, right? And so there's another way of describing that, and I come from a progressive background. We talk about systemic injustice a lot, but what about systemic justice? What will it look like when our culture, our laws, our institutions conspire for maximum human agency and freedom? And how are our stories leading to that time that none of us ever experience, but we should aspire towards, as opposed to another time which is like, wow, those evil Palestinians, those evil Israelis, whatever it may be. And so two skills very quickly I'd focus on: one, listening to understand, like deep listening, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. And it's not to be good storytellers, but story receivers. How do we do that? But there's another principle which I think you referred to. We have these principles and practices of peacemaking. Second practice is holding competing perspectives in tension. And this is something that we have trouble doing. Niels Bohr, the quantum physicist, said the opposite of fact is falsehood, but the opposite of one profound truth may very well be another profound truth. We get that, right? Or you've seen that internet meme with the black and blue dress or the white and gold, right? Like oftentimes we're coming from different positions and positionality, and I see the dress one color, you see it doesn't mean you're lying. And so having this recognition that my story is not the only story, that there's a larger story than all of us. And when we're speaking and I hear an experience which I can't, it's not my job to sit there and say that, well, that's not my experience, therefore you're false or you don't understand your experience. My job as a real storyteller and story listener is to create the space to say, hey, well, just as I'm the expert of my own reality, maybe you are too. And maybe there isn't a manipulation happening here. And maybe if we're getting to that point of maximizing human agency and flourishing, when there's great difference here, maybe there has to be room for all of these stories, and especially the stories we seek to silence. Right? And so I think it's really important to just internalize a practice of deep listening that allows us to hold things which we cannot see go together, but may in some larger story, right? So allowing for that space and being really kind of evangelistic in a way about creating that space to hold multiple truths at the same time.
You're reminding me, I had the chance of participating in a Telos curated trip down to the Deep South 2 years ago, actually exactly 2 years ago in April. And what was particularly unique about this trip was it was the curation of the group were almost all, I was very much sort of the oddball out in this way, Black liturgists and historians of particular local churches that had played a pivotal role in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana throughout the civil rights movement. So there was a real particularity to the history of knowing the songs. And I just mentioned this briefly because I was struck once again by how beautiful the music is and Won't You Be My Neighbor? And then hearing you talk about sort of a space to hold, not in this case, not so much competing truths, but when you're walking through a journey like this, a 7-day trip, you're invariably confronted, if you're a mixed racial group, with, of course, your own social location with one another. And you begin with a lot of politeness, and then you begin into great sorrow, and then you begin into awkward silences, and you go into this like depth of just like you're living in the history of it. And when you're only communicating through words and what you're learning, you get kind of stuck a little bit, especially if we don't all know one another very well in advance. And there was this one moment I vividly remember. There was a Confederate cemetery across the street, and we were in this sort of silk stocking church, as they would say, and one of the gentlemen in the group, there were about 40 of us, just suggested, as we learned about what all happened in this particular church and how the activism began, to sing this hymn from this particular hymnal, and gave the history of the hymn, and he was like, and this is how this march came out of here, and it was all like all this local stuff. And we learned it, those who didn't know it, and we all sang it together, and it was like the turning point on the whole trip, just the way we all walked back onto the bus together, having had this more transcendent we-ness somehow in this moment of struggling beauty, of sort of, grace marching on, overcoming all these things. And there's I'm just putting a note on that too. I think sometimes, Nicholas earlier was talking about art and faith being these ancient things, that the only two things that have endured. And there's something about that, like where do I find hope? It's somehow in those two things that have a way of contributing to a space for stories to pierce through the reductive truths that I think are dominating, not so truths that are dominating so much of our common life. The moderator is not supposed to talk. I apologize about sharing that story, but just to honor and tell us his work. I wanted to ask how narrative and the kinds of, when you say, can we handle the truth? How do narratives that allow us to hear fuller truths that are not always comfortable, how does that practically work its way through an institution like a big university like this, like the place where you work, like Congress, certainly like our media? How practically does that, practically and also poetically, how does it happen? Is that possible? How long does it take?
I'll start, but there's a lot of other ideas on this, I'm sure. Perhaps, I was reciting a line from a movie and a play, but maybe actually truth singular is not the way to frame it, because that implies there is a truth. And part of what I think we're hearing here is that we got to make space for other stories. And oftentimes we've been very afraid to make space for other stories. Monticello is a great example, not wanting other stories, and now actually being at the frontier of trying to tell other stories, and the whole story of the Hemings family. And if you haven't been there recently, Monticello's actually been leading UVA to also try to reconcile with other stories. Not because it's one, but because we need to, you talked about perspectives, hear other perspectives, hear other points of view. Do we tell history just from the perspective, do we tell the history of the hunt from the perspective of the hunter? Or also of the hunted animal? Do we tell the history of Monticello just from the perspective of Thomas Jefferson? Or from some of the people he held in bondage who worked there and made his life possible? Right? Do I tell the story of John Minor just as he went out to greet the Union troops? Or do I tell the story about Henry, who escaped and joined the Union troops because that's how he found his freedom? And I think part of how we do this is by opening up space for additional stories, additional perspectives, additional points of view, and figuring out which have been the perspectives and points of view that have often been left out of these histories. And it's a pretty predictable group of people, so we need to honor and elevate those narratives.
Yeah, I just would say across the board, really in every art form and in every way that history is told, whether it's created or fictional, it's always going to be who is the storyteller. So the one who's telling the story gets to say how it happened. So it has to always be about who gets the pen, right? And how do we make sure that whoever's going to be writing those stories in whatever way, whether it's journalism, whether it is professors, whether it is inside the filmmaking television community, that you have people of diverse backgrounds in every way that word implies diverse, which is to say, it has to be many, many, many perspectives who tell the stories. And there are movements that are being made in my industry toward that end, but we have a very, very, very long way to go. And there's a reason oftentimes you will see the same stories being told again and again, or in different clothes. You're like, I think I saw that already. Why does it seem so familiar? And it's because that guy looks just like that guy, looks just like that guy who came from the same place, which doesn't make his story not important, it's just overrepresented. So I think that it is always going to be, if it's the hunter or the hunted, it depends who has, the pen, the typewriter, whatever it may be, the keyboard. So that's the shift.
Gail, I'd be really curious how you think about the institutional question, given your own personal history and your work at Monticello. Just reflect on that a bit.
Well, thanks. I do have a few ideas about this. First of all, Ian, thank you for the acknowledgement. I am really proud of the work we do at Monticello, and one of my colleagues, Edwina, what is your title now, by the way? Thank you. We do phenomenal work at Monticello, and we have grown in the past several years. However, there's still a lot of work to do. People ask me how I can work at a place where my family was enslaved. And I'll tell them, I have more right to be there than anybody else. My ancestors built that place, literally. Enslaved people gave Jefferson his freedom. Process that for a minute. Enslaved people gave Jefferson his freedom. And I feel that my voice and voices like mine must be heard, and I'll tell you why. Because sometimes we slip. Several years ago, we were having a conversation, my colleagues and I, in the conference room at Monticello about our signature event, which is the naturalization ceremony for July 4th. Has anyone been? Has everyone been? Of course you have. It's a wonderful ceremony. Those of you who have not, I invite you to come. July 4th. Now, we've been telling stories about the enslaved for several years. They've been elevated lately, and we have given the enslaved parity with Jefferson and his family. However, there were some people who didn't appreciate the direction in which we were going. There was some pushback. So at this conference table, there was a discussion about speakers for July 4th. And one member of the leadership team, who's no longer with us, said, "No more Black speakers for this ceremony." I was sitting right beside her, and I thought, how do I react here? I like my job. But I had to be a person of conviction. I had to speak up. But how? Because I was offended. As I can see by your faces, you would have been as well. And I leaned over and I said, kind of the voice I'm using now, gentle. Black people can speak of other things aside from slavery. We are multidimensional people. Back to that word we used earlier, humanizing. We are humans. And I think it was a teaching moment for everyone. We did not have a Black speaker that year, but we have continued with our storytelling and our commitment to the truth. And the truth is, Black people built Monticello. The truth is, Thomas Jefferson owned 607 human beings, some members of his own family. We stick to that truth. And I'm sticking with Monticello because I want to make sure that that message continues. And I think that under our current direction, it is going to. So, thank you for asking.
I'll never know how it feels to be like you, my friend Justin said. Confusedly, I replied, "What do you mean?" He said, "You don't belong anywhere." I replied by saying, "I've lived in the Gaza Strip, went to Egypt, then to Emirates, all the way then to be in Houston and now in Virginia. I'm almost offended. I don't understand it because it's not the fact that I haven't been anywhere. It's the fact that everywhere I've been to is a part of my story." He looked me in the eyes, smiled and said, "Yet you never called any of them home." Speechless is an understatement to describe how I felt in that moment. Thousands of thoughts were on my mind, yet nothing left my mouth. I mean, is it that obvious? I didn't know if it's the way I acted or interacted, if it's the way I talked or speak. I thought I could mask it off, but I was wrong. Then I pondered, how many more people know? And is it one of these things that I can't just hide? You know, people say that perhaps empathy is innate, therefore it's unchangeable, and perhaps empathy is learned, therefore it's adaptable. In fact, when I talked to Justin, he told me it's the latter. He even further explained how when we first met and we became friends, he didn't see right through me. It's not a talent he had. He was able to understand what I was going through, just like how he was able to learn how to walk and talk. It's a process. It's difficult, it's challenging, it's hard. Just like how we all learned how to talk and walk, and we all learn how to create connections and make relationships happen. Then he further explained how this whole thing is just a process. It's a process to walk. It's a process to talk. It's a process to make a friend. And it's a process to get to a point where I can look to my friend in the eyes and say, I see you. In a way, the art of seeing others and being deeply seen is just one side of the coin. And the other side is our capacity and willingness to accept and not judge. Because if I did not open up, Justin would not have the chance to even think about wanting to learn. If Justin was not willing to learn, then my story would have been fallen on deaf ears, but we both chose not to judge. In a way, it's like dancing. It's a decision that we make to learn each other's pattern, as complex and irrational as they are. And so is relationships. You cannot sit on the sidelines and expect your dancing partner to learn how to dance with you. You have to step in and hold their hands and make mistakes and laugh. You have to make it happen, and they have to make it happen too. So with that being said, coming from someone who is still learning how to dance, the more we do it, the better we get at it.
What a beautiful way to end our time with the voice of a student, the voice of hope, the voice of our future. And wow, these 2 hours have definitely demonstrated the power of telling stories. We have experienced that right now, right here together. So I want to thank Anne and Greg and Gail and Ian and Jocelyn and of course, Nicholas and Matt for gathering us all together. I want to thank Steve and Nancy and Julia Scoper for providing for these days of time together to wrestle, to celebrate, to honor, to hear, to just to be, to listen, to attend. So I thank each of you for your beautiful witness, for your work in the world, and to Sherry, most of all, for hosting us this morning. Thank you all.